I talk about this project a lot, and I have a lot of information that I just don't necessarily cover, but there'll be questions are always really good. And then if you want to, toward the end of, once I'm done talking, and if you guys have questions, then we can always just pop upstairs, and if you have any questions about any of the particular photographs, that would be great. So thanks to Rosie again for putting another interesting talk together. I'm really glad. I like this intimate nature of this as opposed to a huge room where I don't really get to know people very well. I've worked as a freelance photographer my whole adult life, and I also have been fortunate to be able to get funding to do projects that are not necessarily related at all to my freelance work. My freelance work is primarily for organizations, for nonprofits, for institutions, for colleges and universities, for magazines, for newspapers. So that's how I've made a living, which has really helped to be able to subsidize my ability to spend 6 years photographing abandoned hospitals and suitcases. So my goal as a photographer when I get hired by somebody is to do exactly what they want me to do. They tell me what they need, I show up on time, I photograph whatever I'm going to be photographing. Hopefully I get great pictures. I deliver the pictures, hopefully they say, thanks, these look great, and then I get paid. That's what my work is like when I work as a freelance photographer. When I work as a person who's doing these kind of long-term photo documentary projects, it's completely different. So the first project that I got funded by the New York State Council on the Arts was documenting 4 abandoned 19th century New York State psychiatric center buildings. The first building that was built in New York State was in Utica, New York, built in the 1830s. It was the first psychiatric center at the time called asylum or a lunatic asylum. 1830s, when you think about it. This building has the largest Greek Revival portico in North America. Huge columns, so you can imagine in 1838 driving a relative in the buckboard up to this massive building and saying goodbye. The idea at Utica was people would be removed from the stresses and strains of their lives and get a chance to get better and then move on. What happened when Willard, which was the second institution in New York State, the state government realized that Willard, or that the idea of just removing people from stresses and from their troubled lives would heal them, realized that there was such a thing as a chronic mental illness. And so Willard was built as the first institution in New York State to treat someone who might come to Willard and spend their whole lives there. So the 4 institutions were, again, Utica, Willard. There's an amazing complex in Buffalo, New York, designed by H.H. Richardson, a very prominent architect. That was another abandoned, empty building. All these buildings were on the grounds of functioning psych centers. It's just that when the state decided they couldn't afford to keep the old buildings up, they literally just put a key in the door, locked it, walked away, and built new buildings right next to it. Mm-hmm. So these are remarkable buildings with the most amazing Greek marble, and the quality of the craftsmanship was unbelievable. Then the 4th building was built as an inebriate asylum in Binghamton, New York, later transitioned into a psych center. So that was the first public funding I got to document buildings that really interested me. That then led to me doing a project on New York State 19th century prison architecture. So I spent a lot of time in Sing Sing and at Dannemora, which is way up north, and in Elmira, which was another late 19th century prison in New York State. And then I did a project again funded by the New York State Council on the Arts on New York State fairground architecture. I spent a couple of years traveling around photographing fairgrounds in New York State. And I did some work on the Erie Canal, photographing Fort Ticonderoga. So what happened was, after Willard, it was clear that I could do what I said I was going to do in these grant proposals. And my name got around so that other nonprofits in New York State that were interested in doing projects related to urban landscape or historic buildings or history in New York State, my name often popped up, so I didn't even really have to go out of my way to try to get these amazing grants, because people knew that the New York State Council on the Arts was inclined to support things that I was doing. So anyway, that's kind of how I divide my life. And the thing with the freelance work that I do is, again, I'm just trying to please a client and get more freelance work. With the work that I do on these projects, my goals are completely different. And I don't have an agenda. I'm not trying to get people to think the way I think about things. The beauty of being an artist in this kind of situation is I can just put these pictures up on a wall and let people react to them as they will. And it saves me from being frustrated by saying, well, this group of people or these people didn't get what I'm trying to do here. Because I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just putting stuff up on a wall. Some people don't pay any attention to it. Some people are moved by it. I can't tell you with the Suitcases project how many times I've gotten emails from people saying, John, I've just spent the last 5 hours on the Suitcases website with tears rolling down my cheeks. And again, as an artist, all I'm really interested in doing is getting a reaction. And I mean, it's very moving to me that people would be emotionally affected by these photographs. But it's also, it's all a bonus, because again, I don't have this plan. I'm not trying to convince anybody that institutionalization was great or terrible or anything, because this whole larger argument about mental health and how our society deals with people who are struggling is just, this argument's going to go on forever. And one of the things that I was advised by some folks in mental health and in the whole idea of institutionalization is that, John, you can have an opinion about this whole thing, but you really need to walk a fine line about giving that opinion. Because some people have the idea that, like Darby Penny, that institutionalization was a form of torture, that mental illness was a social construct and was not anything to do with biology or other issues. I tend not to agree with that. And I think I'd mentioned you, Kelly, Darby hated me. She really hated me. She really thought I was trading on all the hard work she had done, even though I never read her book. I never had anything to do with her. I did introduce myself to her one day, and she was pretty unpleasant to me. But so my approach to it was purely from the form of documenting what I saw in the collection, and I'm so happy that people react to it. So I've learned so much from other people about mental health, institutionalization, mental illness. We've all been touched by it in a personal way, for sure, whether or not it's been our own selves or family members or close friends. When I lived in Ithaca in the 80s, I was shooting these old buildings and spending a lot of time in them. And at one point in one of the buildings, I found this list of the 10 primary reasons why people were institutionalized. And I picked it up and I looked at it, and I realized that in my circle of creative, artistic friends, most of them ticked at least 3 or 4 of those boxes. Excessive masturbation, questions about sexual identity, loss of a loved one, a loss of a child. So they're all these reasons why people were institutionalized. It's clear that things have changed a lot from the 19th century to the 1980s. People were getting treatment even back then, and it's even in some ways better now for the treatments that are available. That's arguable, but this is this is the dock on Seneca Lake in Willard, where on the 13th of October in 1869, Mary Rote, the first Willard patient, arrived in chains from the Columbia County poorhouse. When Dorothea Dix went around and surveyed why states needed to build institutions for people, it was largely by going to county poorhouses, to personal homes where people were really mistreated, other public agencies that were trying to take care of people. She gave her report to the New York State Legislature, and the legislature realized that, yeah, we can do this. Another figure that I throw out once in a while, and I'm not sure of dates and the exact numbers, but at one point, over 60% of the New York State budget went to residential psychiatric centers. 60% of the entire budget, roads, buildings, everything, went to residential psychiatric centers.
What's the statistic right now?
Oh boy, it's pretty low.
Is there a percentage?
I don't know, and I should probably find out. Because now most psychiatric treatment is not residential. New York State closed. Willard was closed in 1995 for reasons of finances. So most of the psych centers were closed. So Willard opened in 1869. There are a lot of postcards. There are a lot of there's a lot of documentation about Willard. The site of Willard was actually the original site that Ezra Cornell had for Cornell University. There's still one of the original buildings where Cornell was thinking about starting what was then the agricultural school. He then moved down to Ithaca probably because Ithaca was even at that time a little bit more of a happening place than Willard. So these are historic photographs. The setting of Willard, it's incredible. It's on Seneca Lake. At one time, it was the largest residential psychiatric facility in the United States. Had a working farm, had shops where patients worked on making gloves, hats, clothes. It was a really extensive, a lot of these institutions were, in spite of the state support, were largely self-sufficient in terms of food and that sort of thing. There's another, like the bird's eye view. Willard was designed, as were a lot of other psych centers in the U.S., on what was called the Kirkbride Plan. Thomas Kirkbride had this idea that all you needed to do, again, was remove people from the stresses of their lives, give them a lovely environment with a lot of light. And you can see here the design of the facility is that the main entrance is the lowest part there. And then you as a patient would come in and you would be moved further out the more troubled you were. The idea, though, with the original Kirkbride plan was that as you got better, you were moved back toward the center of the building and then you could be released. But there's a lot, if you're ever interested in kind of going down the rabbit hole of psych center design, just Google the name Thomas Kirkbride. There's a lot been written about him, and he's really, his designs are really iconic, and all over the United States are Kirkbride buildings. Here's a typical hallway in Willard with patients, and again, a stereoscope of a hallway. As I mentioned, in the early 1980s, I started photographing at Willard. I was shown the building, the original Willard building, the 1869 building, by a friend of mine, Tanya Werbitsky, who is an historic preservationist. And she and I were coming back from a wedding in Geneva, New York one day, and she said, "Hey John, have you ever seen the buildings at Willard?" And I had not. We drove up the circular driveway which is, actually I can go back here quickly, that driveway, that was the original building, and that road still existed. And I immediately felt compelled to try to get inside and photograph. So I spent about a year asking permission from the Willard hierarchy, the folks that ran it. Dr. Anthony Mastilli was the director of Willard. It was always said that he ran Willard like the captain of a ship would run a ship. He made all the decisions. He knew everything that happened. And he also knew that the last thing he wanted was a photographer wandering around in the buildings. And so I was continually rejected. I finally gave up. And then, I don't know, maybe about 18 months after I first started, I got a call from a gentleman who identified himself as Michael LeBate. He was the director of facilities planning for the entire Office of Mental Health in New York State. And he said, "Hey John, I hear you've been trying to get into the buildings at Willard." And I said, "Yeah, but I've had no luck." And he said, "Well, you better hurry because we're going to tear Chapin House down really soon." And I said, "Are you telling me that I now have permission to get in the buildings?" He said, "Yeah." I called Mastilli and I said that I want you into the building to photograph. So he told me what to do. I made contact with Willard. I went there with a friend of mine who is also a historic preservationist, and I was escorted with my friend by 3 Willard security guards to make sure I didn't get into trouble. My friend Richard Piper we would be walking through this building, and we'd get into a doorway, and I'd have my tripod and my cameras, and then Piper would be behind me, and then he would stop in a doorway and turn around and ask a question. And then I would just keep walking, and it was his way of running interference for me to keep these guys sort of out of my hair while I worked. The first image that I took when I walked in the back of Chapin House was this image, and I saw these devices, and I was really interested, so I walked over and I tried to pick up one of them, and it was so heavy I couldn't even really lift it off the floor. And so I turned to one of the guards and I said, what are these? And he said, "The floors in all of our buildings are hardwood, and we use paraffin to keep them looking good and being preserved." And he said, "We put chamois cloths on the bottom of these very heavy devices and rub them with paraffin, and the patients get to walk up and down the hall, keeping the floors preserved and keeping them from drying out." It's amazing when you think about paraffin. It's wax. It's very flammable. That these buildings didn't burn is amazing. And I'll kind of remember this image. I'll come back to talk about it in a little while, because when I first was in this building, I was only interested in what was in the buildings and the buildings themselves. So going up into this hallway, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little Chinese checkers board there. There's a piano there. These are buildings that had been in use probably up until about 6 or 7 years before I got there, maybe 10 years. Most of the buildings are that New York State institutional green. There was still a lot of furniture. There was still a lot of other artifacts left over from the time that they were used as buildings. This is one of the connecting corridors that Kirkbride favored. As the buildings were stepped back, a lot of the corridors were connected by these sort of half-circular rooms. This is in Utica. You can see the floors are buckled. The fact that I had keys to this building in Utica, the 1838 building. The fact that they even allowed me in here is remarkable. This would never, ever happen now. Utica was really interesting. It had a jazz band made up of patients. It had a literary journal. You can go online and Google Utica Psych Center Literary Journal. Their creative writing. There were plays put on. There were all kinds of things that connected the patients to doing something, to keeping busy, to being creative. again, I was always interested in things that were left behind, calendars, any sort of evidence of paintings on the wall, the idea of how the buildings were divided up, the different wards. This is a photo of Buffalo, incredible open areas, fireplaces on every floor. Again, more things that were left behind, even identifying patients by their names. Again, just patterns of things that really interested me. You can see the skylight at the top of this picture. These were designed, these buildings, especially the early buildings, this one that you're seeing now is Utica. So it was built in 1838. So the buildings were designed with light that would come down from the roof, and then there were, it's hard to see in here, but the floors were glass panels, so the light would come down through the floors and it would keep going down. So again, this idea of light and peaceful places. I tell a lot of anecdotes when I talk about this project. I was walking down a hallway in Utica with a nurse. It was a hallway very much like this one, with a nurse who had worked on that very ward. And as we were walking, I was to her right, and she was here. And as we were walking down this long corridor, we were walking, and then she nudged me to my right, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And she just stopped, and she put her face in her hands, and she said, "I haven't worked in this building in 10 years." And she said, there was a woman who sat right there in a chair in the hallway. And if you walked close to her, she would really lose it and start screaming and yelling. So everybody walked around her. And here's a nurse who had worked in that building, who had worked with that person, who still had that conditioned memory of that. And that chair wasn't there were no other people there, but she still wanted to sort of get around that area. And I started, that was one of the early times that I had the feeling that my interest in just the buildings and the things that were left behind was really just the surface of what was going on in these buildings, and the interaction between the staff and the patients, and how these patients were real human beings. So that black and white photograph of the mop-like things that buffed the floors, to me was just, when I took that picture, was just had to do with some weird thing that I'd never seen before, with an interesting story. But what happened after I started getting these feelings about the buildings and what the buildings stood for, what they were used for, I started really thinking very, very heavily about the people that were in the buildings. This is a photograph I took of Chapin House very shortly before it was demolished. It was just an incredible building. You can see the cyclone fence on the left side there. It's just a complete shame that the state just walked away from it and tore it down. In 1995, Willard closed, and the staff of the hospital, who were all state employees, were given a couple of options. The first option was retire. The second option was take a job at another New York State institution, whether it was a psych center or a prison or any other kind of institution. A lot of the people who work at Willard were second and third generation Willard and the area residents who had worked there because their parents worked there and because their grandparents worked there. So when Willard closed, a couple of the employees were given the job of going through all of the buildings to determine what should be thrown away, what should be repurposed by the state, what should be sold by the state. And this woman, whose name is Beverly Courtright, was a nurse at Willard. Her parents worked at Willard, and I'm pretty sure her grandparents worked at Willard. And Beverly grew up thinking that she just had a lot of aunties because she lived in the little town of Willard, and there were always women in the house living with them for periods of time. Willard had a program where if you were doing pretty well in the hospital, it's called family care, you could sort of move your way out by transitioning through some of the local families. Some of the local families did it for economic reasons because you're paid, but in Beverly's case, her parents did it because they worked at Willard, they really cared for these people, and they would often have who Beverly thought were just aunties because everybody just called them Auntie Clarissa or Auntie Betty or whatever, and they would move on. Some would go back into the institution, some would then go back into the real world. And so as a young girl, she just thought this is just a completely normal thing. There was a tremendous amount of interaction between the patients and the residents and the staff. It really was incredible. Beverly put a key in that door and opened it up and saw these racks filled with over 400 suitcases that belonged to former patients at Willard who had all died at Willard and who were mostly buried across the street in the Willard Cemetery. She said that she felt a whoosh of energy go over her. And this is a woman who lives in central New York. I don't think she does yoga or, communes with nature in any kind of a higher level. She's not prone to the hyperbole of emotion and energy. She's a very down-to-earth New York State person, but she said she just felt this thing go right past her. And so she was with her sister, and her sister said, Beverly, let's open up these cases and see what's in it. And Beverly said, no, we're not doing this. One of the curators of the New York State Museum was there on the grounds at the time. His name is Craig Williams, and he's the one who eventually gave me permission to photograph all these suitcases. Beverly said, no, we got to talk to Craig about this. So Craig came over as a curator, as a state employee, but working at the State Museum, saw the suitcases, immediately called his bosses, who said, oh, just grab 10 of them and throw the rest away. And Craig ignored that, went back to Albany, got a huge truck, loaded it up, and took all of the suitcases back to Albany, where they were eventually curated, cataloged, and conserved by a couple of interns, actually, staff interns. And the fact that the suitcases were saved in that way is miraculous. It's really miraculous. It's a unique collection. There's nothing like it in the world representing what patients' lives were like during the time that they were institutionalized. You can see there's a central walkway and right and left racks. Women were on one side, men were on the other, just like in the wards. They were alphabetized by patient. There was clearly a system set up. And I've talked to so many former employees at Willard. They don't do it anymore because most of them are a bit too old, but every year they used to have a potluck reunion in the summer where everybody would come and bring food, and it was on the grounds of the institution, and they would talk about working there. And there was some institutional memory that these suitcases existed up in the attic of the sheltered workshop building, but they were there undisturbed from the last cases went in the early 1960s, and they were up there for 35 years when the institution closed in '95 before they were rediscovered. So here, this is Bev, and that's Craig Williams, the New York State Museum curator that has facilitated all of this. Craig is really amazing, and in fact ended up pretty much losing his job over the fact that he was really interested in preserving New York State history and saving it and collecting it, and his bosses finally just didn't agree with his point of view, and they said, Craig, it's time to retire. In the early 2000s, an exhibit was held at the New York State Museum which featured some of the suitcases, the actual suitcases, with some history that Darby Penny had put together of the patients. Darby also had been an employee at the Office of Mental Health in New York State, and she had access to the medical records because she was an employee. She changed the names, the first names and last names. I was advised by lawyers that I was not allowed to use the surname of the patients, but I could use their first name. So the first day I went in 2011, I went out to the New York State storage facility in Rotterdam, New York. I had no idea what I was going to do. Craig had said, John, if you want to photograph some of these cases, please, I'll pull a few of them out, you can do it. And so I set up my wrinkled seamless background, and I put the first suitcase on the background, and I thought, oh, the archival paper that's wrapped around the suitcase kind of reflects my view of the whole project. And I thought, well, I'm just going to document the whole process of every suitcase. I'm going to take a picture of the thing wrapped up, the way the museum wrapped it up. I'm going to then take a picture of it as it's partially unwrapped, and then I'm going to start photographing the objects. Now, the problem that I had is all of the documentation that I've ever done of any of those projects was based on just showing up and photographing what is. All of the Silent Voices photographs, I didn't rearrange things. I would walk into a room and photograph what I saw. I really thought it was important to document what was there and not some setup. So for some reason I was not thinking. I thought, oh, I'll open up these suitcases and there'll be this amazing tableau of these objects, and I'll just take the pictures and move on. Well, you can see in this picture the top of a plastic bag peeking up. Every object in the collection was conserved by the State Museum. Every object had a catalog number, and every object was in either an archival plastic bag or archival paper. So then what I did that first day was take everything out of those bags and keep the numbers separated. And then I took a lot of pictures that day. And then I realized at the end that I had to put it all back. I'm really bad at spatial, organizational, I'm so bad at it. So I think I spent 2 hours photographing, and I probably spent 3 or 4 hours trying to remember where everything was. And that was the one case I photographed that day. I didn't photograph any other cases. And very quickly, Craig connected me with another of the people who worked at the museum, but she worked there only as a volunteer. Her name is Peggy Ross. Then Peggy immediately started assisting me in all these shoots that we did over the 6 years. And she has the kind of mind and eye that can remember things. So as we would be working in the storage facility in Rotterdam, I had a table set up and had my lights set up, and I would shoot maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days a month. And I lived 2.5 hours away from it, so I would drive over and work and photograph. And Peggy would be at one table. She would help me set up the tableau that I would photograph. Then I would start photographing. She would remember how we had unwrapped everything, keep a list of all, put it all back together, and then put it back in the case. And in the meantime, keeping a really good database of everything we've done. So today what I'm going to do is just show you a few of the patients that I found kind of interesting. This is the case of Dmitry. Dmitry was Ukrainian. There are some very interesting stories about his life and how he came to be at Willard. Almost every suitcase had these original handwritten notes by the staff, to attach to the suitcase so that they would be identified. Patients did generally have access to their suitcases while they were patients, but I photographed all these labels that I could. In fact, I kept thinking that you could do an entire exhibit just on these handwritten labels, which tell so much. You can see there's a date. Dimitri had, for some reason, 2 separate dates, both in 1953, but it's got his name, it's got where he was admitted from, what the one brown suitcase. So you know there's a lot of information there. So Dimitri was a very creative person. He was a painter. He came to Willard, I later found out, because his wife died in childbirth and he was disconsolate. When I was setting up this tableau of Dimitri's possessions, I realized that on the left side of this tableau that I set up was a picture of Dimitri and his bride at their wedding, and these fabric flowers that were in his case were part of that bouquet that she was holding in the wedding picture. There were a lot of very obviously touching and emotional aspects to this project, and people ask me a lot if I can identify with a specific case, and there is one case that I sometimes talk about that really got me in a personal way, but my whole goal in doing a project like this is if I'm not feeling something from the objects, then the people who are looking at my photographs aren't going to feel anything. There has to be a direct connection, and with this project specifically, I really feel like I was not much more than a conduit. I get to a point as a photographer where I don't have to really think about the camera, I don't have to think about the lighting, I don't have to think that much about the setup because it just seems to happen naturally. But all of the technical stuff is sort of subconscious, so that it allows me to really connect with whatever it is I'm photographing. And I find it's the same way in my freelance work. If I'm photographing people, if I'm interacting with people, I spent several years photographing the living conditions of rural poor people in New York State, and I was invited into their homes and I would talk to them and then photograph them, and that emotional connection was something that I realized that I had to develop really quickly. I couldn't just barge in and photograph people as if, you know, I'm the photographer, they're the subject. There has to be a connection, and it flows through everything that I do, especially these personal projects. Dimitri was a draftsman, pretty clearly. He brought stuff from the old country, you know, Christmas and other kinds of little tchotchke things, notes. The suitcases contained lots of correspondence, lots of letters. Here's Dimitri at Willard. He was a painter. Craig Williams has a very interesting story about trying to track Dimitri down after he was released from Willard in '95 when the institution closed. And the state wouldn't give Craig any information about where Dimitri was because of medical issues, medical privacy laws. But Craig heard a rumor that Dimitri was in a nursing home in Norwich, New York. Craig went there and actually saw a painting on the wall that he knew was Dimitri's. Unfortunately, Dimitri had died months before. But his artwork was all over Willard. And this is a pretty good example of one of the crafts rooms at Willard. You can see Dimitri was painting, but there were looms, so people could do a lot of creative things. Here's another patient at Willard that I found really interesting. Frank, his name is Frank Combs. He, Willard, when the patients were admitted, comprehensive lists of what they brought with them were created. A lot of those lists were in the suitcases or in the boxes where the suitcases were stored. Frank was in the military. I heard through Karen Miller, who saw Frank's medical records, that he was living in New York City. He was having a meal in a diner. He was served food on a chipped plate. Felt like he was being dissed by the waitress. Had a bit of a meltdown. Was taken to Bellevue. Was evaluated, and was eventually transferred up to Willard. Again, people brought stuff with them from their previous lives. Frank brought a lot of his military objects. I would post this stuff on the internet as I was shooting it on my WordPress site, and I would post a picture like this, and I'd get an email from someone saying, "Oh, I live right around the corner from 135 Decatur Street in Brooklyn. Why don't I go take a picture of it and send it to you?" So it was always interesting to me that, again, this is a real person who had a real life, who lived before he came to Willard at 135 Decatur Street in Brooklyn. I'll get more of Dimitri's drawings. The label that would have been on his suitcase when it was sent up to Willard. Many patients were not brought by family members. Many patients were transferred there by the state, and their possessions were just shipped. More evidence of Frank's time in the Army. Lots of little strange objects, some of which I could never figure out what they were. A little toy gun here. I was especially interested in photographs that Frank had brought with him of clearly himself, but some of his friends. Reflects a really interesting time in New York City. His military garb was spotless. It was all folded very neatly, and again, another shipping. I was really interested in labels when I was photographing this project. Frank's undergarments were really beautiful and clean and well cared for. His gloves that were clearly used. Shirts with ties, his military shirts with ties, socks rolled up, his hat. You can see he was very meticulous and took great care of his things. Another case with his lovely maroon swimming costume there. Handkerchiefs, I love that sort of Art Deco design on the handkerchiefs. More pictures of Frank in his service uniforms, and more of the, obviously, ration books and other ephemera from the Second World War. Handwritten notes about his discharge from the military, from his commanding officer. Here's an ID card. Correspondence with the War Department. Pieces of newspapers talking about what was going on. Again, a handwritten note from the chief of command, the colonel, about why Frank needed to be discharged. Again, lots of correspondence with pictures, Monopoly money, bank statements, more pictures of his friends in New York City and Harlem. Another patient, Charles F., a Jewish patient. Willard was very diverse in its own way. A lot of people from foreign countries, a lot of people from different religions, different races. So it was a state institution that had residents from all over the state. Charles F. Was an Orthodox Jew who ended up at Willard. Came with him with tools, with things like shoelaces, with lots of his own artifacts from his life as a practicing Jew. Books, pictures, again, more evidence of his practice. Just really kind of compelling. I worked with a writer named Ilan Stavens on a book that came out through the State University of New York Press on Charles. Ilan tried to get access to Charles's medical records so he could write a book about him. The state told him that There was no way that was going to happen. And so what Elon did was he worked with me. We published a book together. The title, well, the book, what Elon did was to create a fictional life about Charles. And the first part of the book is Charles's fictional life, why he was institutionalized. And then partway through that description, Elon writes, everything I've written is a lie, because the state of New York will not allow any access to Charles's real life. So I've created this life for Charles based on Jon's pictures and what I think Charles' life might be like. And then he goes back to the recreation of Charles's life, and then there's a section of the book where Elon and I talk about Willard, talk about my experience photographing these objects. And Elon is a really interesting guy. Born in Mexico City to a Jewish family. When he lived in Mexico, he was always the different one. He was one of the few Jews in his neighborhood, so he was really different. And then he came to the United States to get a graduate degree at Columbia University, and all of a sudden he became a Mexican because he came from Mexico. So Elon is really interested in how we all identify ourselves and how other people identify us. And he's fascinated by this idea that you can be a different person to different people depending on the environment that you're in. So the book is a really interesting book. I find it really interesting. Elon is a very ambitious guy who moves on to other things very quickly, so it sort of came out and then we haven't really done much with it, but it's interesting. So there's more of Charles's objects in one of these big shipping trunks, travel trunks. Shirt collars, identification. Now I've had to obscure his surname because of New York State law. It's a very complicated thing. I won't get into it now. If anyone wants to ask me about it later, I'm happy to talk about it. But the state of New York is really basically unhappy with the attention that my project has brought to these patients, and there's a lot of stuff going on with the state and with the lawyers who initially are trying to sort of shut down my ability to do this work. But it's been resolved, and I can talk about that a little if anybody's interested. Always interested in little notes that were found in the suitcases. Again, things were saved. So a lot of the things that, for example, here Charles's immunization or his coming to the United States papers, his citizenship papers. It's important to note that the patients came with a lot of things from their previous lives, but they also accumulated things in their lives at Willard. So the suitcases contained things that they were using all the time. I always show this picture because this was a toothpick and a little scrap of paper. It was the only thing in this particular case, and it had a catalog number. So I mean, when New York State did this, they did it right. They cataloged every item in these suitcases. I talked about the cemetery. This is Lawrence Mocha. Lawrence, for 40 years, dug every grave in the cemetery across the street from the institution. During the warm months, he lived in a shack down at the cemetery. Lawrence was a guy who came to America, had a brain injury, ended up at Willard, had no family. There was no real way to identify him. A group of people around who live in Willard wanted to build a monument to Lawrence on the grounds of the cemetery, and they wanted to name him and thank Lawrence for the 40 years that he dug every grave in the cemetery. And the state found out about it, and they said, absolutely, you cannot do that. We will come after you legally. Patients' rights, patients shouldn't be named. You absolutely cannot do this monument. A reporter for the New York Times heard about it and wrote a long article about how stupid the state was being in not allowing Lawrence Mocha to be memorialized for the work he did in that cemetery. So the state finally relinquished. They, in inverted commas, found a family member living out in Kansas that signed off on pages and pages and pages of documentation saying that they could use Lawrence's name. But there's a beautiful monument in the cemetery with Lawrence's name on it. These are some of the gravestones that are still around. Again, just numbers. We're nearing the end of this, so I hope you're all doing okay here. I mentioned that the New York State Archives contains every medical record of every patient who ever came to Willard. And this is Dr. Karen Miller, who had access to these records and who got me into the archives to be able to photograph the records. That pile of papers right in front of her is one patient. That's one patient's records. So New York State was pretty good at keeping notes. These are, this is a photograph that I printed from upstairs, but this is one of the poems that Karen has written based on the medical records and also based on the access that she had to the objects. Again, these are the original, on the right here, these are the original books. You can see, again, patient records. This is one patient's record. I was really just overwhelmed seeing photographs of these folks and reading about the diagnoses and why they were in the hospital. Being able to read the intake notes of the interviews, the original interviews when people were brought to Willard, talking about what their lives were like. I mean, it's just incredible to me that these were transcribed and typed up, but these were all part of the medical records. Reasons for medication, you can read Thorazine and other drugs, and on the right is mineral oil. And I said to Karen, there are pages and pages and pages of mineral oil. What's that all about? She said, well, most of the drugs that these patients were given are really constipating. And so the patients would be continually dosed with mineral oil to keep things moving along. Again, medical records, nurses' notes about the patient on any given day, more information, letters. There's a letter to Dr. Mastilli about one of the patients who had died. More notes, more photographs. Here are reasons for admittance, whether it was by a judge or whether it was by a family member. Voluntary admittance. It's funny when I talk to some of the nurses that I know at Willard, they recognize these folks. They work with these people. There was some idea that Willard was more like a family situation than a psychiatric center. And I've bought into that to a large degree, but I also have a very close friend who worked at Willard as a representative of Tompkins County, which is just south of the hospital. And Terry's job was to go into Willard for about 4 years and interview patients to determine whether or not they should be deinstitutionalized. And Terry has a completely different take on what it was like to be a patient at Willard. He saw things that were really disturbing to him. He likes the folks that work there. He thinks they were really honorable and really trying to help people. But his approach to judging those people is based on the fact that they just didn't really know what they were doing. They had the best intentions in their hearts, but they weren't necessarily, they were doing things that were maybe not so good in a human way. If you talk to the nurses, and I've spent a lot of time talking to these folks and interviewing them, they really think that they were creating a family environment. In fact, Peggy Ellsworth, one of the nurses that I'm closest to, said to me, she said, John, if we did anything wrong, is that we showed too much love to these people. Because when when Willard closed in 1995, they were heartbroken. And in fact, I know that to be true. I've talked to so many staff members whose job it was to move patients from Willard when it closed to nursing homes or other state institutions, or move them out into the community. And people were heartbroken after having lived at Willard for 60 or 70 years. There were people who died at Willard at the age of 101. There were pictures in the local press of 100th birthday celebrations of people at Willard, with photographs of people with their names printed. You know? So, I mean, this whole thing about privacy is really absurd. So I'm going to close up right here. I always show this slide at the end, and especially because you were a nurse, I like graphic images, and I came across this postcard, and this idea that no matter what you think of institutions, there always were people there wanting to help and trying to do the best they could. And nurses in my own personal life have meant so much. Our son was a preemie, he was in a NICU for 3 months. It was the nurses who basically saved his life and saved our lives. And so when I think about places like Willard, which had a nursing school, and most of the nurses who worked at Willard were students at the nursing school at Willard, they wanted to help, and they did help, and they made the lives of those folks that were institutionalized as good as they could possibly be. So I think it all goes back to that idea. Those of you who work in mental health, those of you who have had experience in mental health, it's one of the hardest jobs in the world, and yet it's just amazing to me that you all do that kind of work. And whether it's mental health or physical health, it's that kind of sacrifice and selflessness to try to help other people. One of the folks I've talked to here in Toledo does work in a hospice center, and that's Sherry. And you work in a hospice center, I mean, people are dying all the time. And yet, as she would say, it's one of the most fulfilling jobs she's ever had. So, yeah, so that's basically the presentation I have. Willard is on the shores of Seneca Lake, on one of the Finger Lakes, and the cemetery it's just the most amazing place in the world because it has this beautiful view of the lake, and it's very pastoral. It's green grass, it's trees, it's just remarkable. Yeah, some of the folks at Willard, there are some named gravestones of veterans.
Okay.
But this whole thing is just huge. And let me just tell you this anecdote quickly because I think it's a fascinating story. I worked in conjunction with a poet and a psychiatrist named Karen Miller. And Karen Miller has just retired as a psychiatrist. She was also institutionalized as a young person in Massachusetts, and she's a poet. She's an incredible poet. She spent a year getting access to the medical records of the suitcase owners. So she actually had access to medical records. I'll show some pictures of her and the records later. She came across a fellow who lives still near Willard, probably about an hour away. He was adopted as a child, spent much of his young adult life trying to find out where he was adopted, who his birth mother was, who his father was. It was really something that he worked on for a long time. He ended up getting a job at Willard as a maintenance guy. And I get chills whenever I tell the story. I actually spent an afternoon with him and photographed him and talked to him, and Karen spent a couple of days with him. When he was working at Willard, he was just casually mentioning to someone who worked in the medical records office that he was adopted, and that it was just a lunch conversation, that he was adopted that he spent years and years trying to find the hospital where he was born, and he ran up against a brick wall. You never get any information. He's probably now in his 60s. And the woman he was talking to who worked in medical records at Willard said, well, you know, there were babies born here at Willard. And he said, really? I never heard anything about that. And she said, oh yeah. She said, it was a working hospital, but there were babies born to patients who were here. And he said, well, how would I get that information? And she said, oh, those records are completely sealed. So then one day, not long after, there was Willard was still open at the time. There was a campus-wide fire drill where all the buildings were to be vacated. And it was advertised, everybody knew about it, and this woman said to this gentleman, well, there's this fire drill, I'm not going to be here. All those records are upstairs in the filing cabinets, and they're listed by date. He knew his birthday. And she said, gee, if someone were to go up there during the fire drill, I would have no idea that ever happened. So he went, fire drill happens, he goes up into the medical records, goes right to the day he was born, and sees a woman who bore a child on that specific day, and he was just overwhelmed. So he mentioned to someone on the campus of Willard that this had happened, and they said, oh, I knew her. She's in a nursing home just down the road, and she's still alive. So he went and met his mother and discovered an entire family of siblings and heard the whole story and stayed connected with them for until she died. So I mean, there was a huge dedication for the monument that finally was built in Lawrence's honor. And I've been corresponding with a woman who was really interested in the project. And I arranged to meet her that day because she lives in Rochester and I live in Massachusetts, but I was there for this thing. And so we met after this event, and she said, John, she had written to me about this, and she said, I'm so upset because she read a comment on one of the posts that I had done on my WordPress site, where one of the commentators said, oh, it's such a shame about these forgotten people. And she said, I'm here to say that wasn't the case, at least in my own family. She said, my aunt was at Willard, and she was definitely not forgotten. She lived there her whole adult life, but every holiday we would drive down, we'd pick her up, we would take her back for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, for whatever, and she said, we never forgot her. She couldn't live with us, we couldn't take care of her, which was why she was at Willard, but we all loved her as kids because she'd come home and she would swear like a sailor, and she was like really exotic to them. But and I've since talked to a lot of other people who say they were not forgotten people. Although on the other side of that, I know a woman who said that she grew up very close to Willard, and she said when this was about 5 years ago, I talked to this woman who was probably in her 60s at that time, and she said, my elderly mother was dying and said to me, oh, by the way, my sister had been at Willard for her whole life and died several years ago. And the daughter, the woman that I had been corresponding with and had talked to, said, and she was so upset about that because she and her family had driven by the entrance to Willard hundreds of times. And her mother never said, oh, you have an aunt there. Let's go see her. So there were definitely two sides to that. The reason the suitcases exist is because when a patient died at Willard, the state gave families two options. First of all, there weren't always families to contact. but if there were family contact, the option was you can either have the state ship all these objects to you COD. In other words, you got to pay for it. Or you can drive up to Willard and pick this stuff up and take it. Well, Willard was largely populated by people from not the immediate area. A lot of downstate people in New York City. And back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, you weren't just going to get in your car and drive to Willard, New York to pick up the objects of someone who you largely didn't have anything to do with for years and years anyway. And financially, you wouldn't necessarily want to pay to have a giant trunk loaded with the objects of someone that had lived away from you forever. So that's why 420 suitcases were up in that attic, and the fact that they were saved is miraculous, and the fact that there's so many components of this thing. Every step of the way, things could have gone wrong. One of the things the state doesn't like that I'm doing is I'm constantly bringing attention. And they're a big bureaucracy, and they don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
The irony is that when the suitcases were rediscovered, the director of New York State Office of Mental Health thought this was the greatest thing in the world. He thought, this is going to help to destigmatize people who were institutionalized. And that's really our goal as the Office of Mental Health. And Karen Miller's work, because she had access to the medical records, her work, and you can read some of the then and now things up there, the before and after stuff, because that was her work.
Yeah.
And so she had access to every one of the suitcase owners, and she knows why they were there and what their lives were
So
like.
she wrote the then and now?
Yeah.
She did, okay. Who were you most emotionally involved with? How did you decide who was going to be in the exhibit?
Yeah.
I mean,
the one case that really got me, where I found that I was in tears, my head was in my hands, Peggy looked over at me and said, "John, what's wrong?" Was a photographer. There are pictures upstairs of his stuff.
Yeah.
He was at a facility in New York State before Willard that was for epileptics, right? So clearly he had epilepsy. So he was a photographer. He had epilepsy. He started making noises at that facility because they were using him as a photographer. And he said, "Hey, you should pay me." And he was obstreperous, and he kept on about that. The rest of them, people asked me, and in fact I was on a Zoom call with the cast the other night, and Neil, this fellow, asked me, if there were specific cases that really were important to me. That one clearly, but my answer generally is I really see this whole thing as a body of work, not as, it's hard for me to even think about individual cases that meant something to me, because they all meant something. And I just didn't want to, I just don't ever feel like I want to break that down. In terms of the editing, that's a really big problem, because I've got tens and tens of thousands of images that I took in 6 years. And there are some times I'll look at an image on my computer screen and know right away that's it. But this is just overwhelming. And I remember I did this work, but what's weird about it is I did this work, and I can go upstairs and look at these pictures and go, wow, that's amazing. And then go, oh yeah, I did that. So, it's not an ego thing. As I said, I try to deflect. I really feel like I was more of a conduit than anything. But which probably enables me to move away from it and go, wow, those are amazing, because they kind of came through me. It wasn't something I necessarily just created. It was with the help of those people who were institutionalized. They're the ones who did the heavy lifting.